Thanks for all for coming and to stay here because it's a long day, and I understand quite well that you are tired. I try to be a bit funny, but it's not easy to be funny to speak about present-day Belarus and its history. And I'd like to start from the moment that to understand Belarus, one should take into account that Belarus belongs to two regions. The first region is Eastern Europe, and it means that the way of the formation of nations in Eastern Europe was based on the distinctions of cultures and languages. It means that the separate language, it means that separate language and separate culture means the possibility, legitimization of the formation of the independent state. This is a particular type of so-called ethno-linguistic nationalism which successfully transformed in the most East European countries into the civic one. But the rule now is the same. Each state should has each her own language and culture. And another moment that Belarus belongs to the region of the East European borderland. This is a multicultural space, and in this space, each person should in each moment in history determine to what culture to belong, what identity to choose. His or her own identity or identity of temporarily dominated culture would be changed during the life of one generation several times. And now I can present several evidence of our situation on the border. Belarus is a unique country which has, could you imagine, two Easters, Orthodox and Catholics, its official holidays, two Christmases. We have also officially, we have two official languages, indeed just one, just Russian, and we have two national holidays, one official and another national independence holiday which is prohibited. How it was happened? Probably you know that in pre-industrial society, religion, confessional belonging played crucial role in the self-identification. In the middle of the 19th century, famous Belarusian, Lithuanian and Polish scholar, historian and ethnographer Adam Kirkor describes a very interesting situation of the conversation in between him and one peasant in the surroundings of the Minsk, which is now the capital of Belarus. Kirkor asked peasant about his confessional belonging, and the answer was, the peasant said, that previously he belonged to the Polish church. Polish, not Catholic, Polish church. And now probably to Russian one. And this probably is the key element to understand this situation in Belarus on the border. Christianity came to Belarus from Byzantium through Kiev in the late 10th century. In the 14th century, nobility turned to Catholicism. In the 16th century, to Calvinism. In the 17th century, once again to Catholicism. And in the 17th century, it was invented typical border phenomenon, confessional union church, By the end of the 18th century, 80% of Belarusians were unions. But in the middle of the 19th century, a Russian authority prohibited union church and converted all unions into the Orthodox one and heavily pressed on the Catholics. In the interwar period, in the western part of Belarus, Polish authority pressed on Orthodox, Soviet authority both on Catholics and Orthodox. And now official propaganda in Belarus presents Belarus as predominantly as an Orthodox country, but it's not true. According to sociological polls, Belarus is not a religious country at all. Less than 30% of the population are really religious. And from the point of view of the number of religious community, the first place, not Orthodox and not Catholics, but Protestant. And this is a typical example of our borders. Another moment, very important to understand what is to be on the border. Timothy Snyder, famous American historian, labeled the territory of the Eastern European borderland as a bloodlands because of the extraordinary scale of extermination of population in the 1930s and 40s. And of course, Belarus also is a typical example of the bloodland, and not only because of Hitler and Stalin. It's also because that Belarusians used to live on the border. We used not only to live on the border, we used to be the border as such. And we used to think that the border usually has less value than the core. Exactly in those situations when the population of the border differ from the core, from the terms of religion, identity, language, and so on. And Belarus suffered not only World War II and Stalinist repressions, it also suffered from the so-called Soviet-Polish War, from the World War I, from the Napoleon invasion, from the so-called Nordic War in the beginning of the 18th century. And the most terrible war was in the middle of the 17th century. And I'd like you to hear just for a moment the sound of Belarusian language. This is Belarusian proverb, which noted after the 200 years after this war. Стуль москали, а стуль шведы, нема деться с великой беды. From the one side, Russians, from the other, Swedes, no escape from the great trouble. This is a period which famous Polish writer, who was born in Lithuania, by the way, Hanne Severinsen, labeled as the Great Flindt. In this period, more than half, imagine, more than half of the population of Belarus were killed. And the history of this war now out of the focus of the people and out of the historical discourse, but it's a very good example for understanding this answer of present to Adam Kirkor. Why he said that he probably belongs to Russian church. He was definitely sure about his belonging, but he was not sure about what answer to choose when he met some stranger. A stranger person could be dangerous for him. And this is the main peculiarity of the not Belarusian identity, Belarusian existence as such, because the main idea is to survive on the border. Belarusian national movement started its existence at the very beginning of the 19th century, but Russian imperial authority didn't recognize Belarusians like Ukrainians as a separate people at all. They decided that Belarusians just a part of Russians polluted by the Polish influences. Because of this, all attempts to start national agitation in Belarus were cruelly persecuted but the main obstacle was general backwardness of Belarus as such. By the end of the 19th century, 96% of Belarusians were peasants and lived in the rural area, and 87% of Belarusians were illiterate. Nevertheless, in the beginning of the 20th century, during the so-called First Russian Revolution, appeared organized Belarusian national movement in 1905, and during the Great Russian Revolution appeared a group of people who proclaimed the feeling of Belarusians to live in independent country. On the 25th of March 1918, so-called Belarusian People Republic proclaimed its independence, and it laid down the way to the creation in the Soviet Union, so-called BSSR, Belarusian Administrative Autonomy, which during the short period of Belarusization, its 1920s, got some trace of the true nation state. It had its own government, parliament, national university, national archive, national library, etc. And I'd like to stress that in this state there were 4 official languages dominated Belarusian, but also official status had Polish language, Russian, and Yiddish. And Belarus was the only country in the history of the world where Yiddish had official status. By the end of the 1920s, it appeared the core of the national identity, which was centered, first of all, to the Belarusian language, to the history of the early medieval kingdoms of Polotsk and Turov, to the history of Magnus II of Lithuania, because it was our common state with Lithuanians, and to such heroes as the pioneer of the East Slavic book printing, Francis Karina, who, by the way, spent several years in Copenhagen, and the leader of the middle of the 19th century uprising, Kostus Kalinowski. But this identity has no chance to get massive support because of, first of all, massive repressions in the end of the 1930s. And these Stalinist repressions were targeted towards national political elite, national intellectuals, Belarusian language as such, and Belarusian literature. I give for you just several examples. In the night of the October 29, 1937, 132 writers, could you imagine, 132 writers were exterminated during the one night. In the middle of the 1930s, in the Belarusian Academy of Science, were 136 doctoral students. In the 1939, just 6 of them were alive. All others were simply physically exterminated. And this negative effects of the massive political repressions was intensified by the World War II, where at least 25% of population of Belarus were killed. Their major cities were destroyed. And after this war, Belarus was devastated, depopulated territory, and basically almost pure intellectual desert. Until the end of the 1950s, Belarus was one of the most backward republics in the Soviet Union, where 71% of population lived in the rural areas. It was Belarusian who wrote in the Stalinist collective farms, which means modernized serfdom. And in 1960s, 70s, and 80s, extraordinarily rapid Belarus transformed from the backward republic to one of the most advanced in the Soviet Union. It means that great number of former collective farmers moved to the cities, to the 8-hour working day, to guaranteed salary, to modern block of apartments with all utilities, with cold and hot water, refrigerators, TV sets, etc. And for them it means real miracle. And it was really a miracle. But this miracle had a reverse side, and this reverse side means that Belarusian language becomes the mark and the stigma of backwardness, of your connection to the collective farm, to the rural area. And the Russian language is a mark of the progress. And this attitude toward Belarusian language was supported by official ideology, which promised to Soviet Union to construct nationalist communism by the 1st of January of 1980. This is a true story about Nikita Khrushchev, who participated in the meeting of the professor of students of Belarusian State University in 1960. It was a leader of Belarus, Kirill Mazurov, who delivered the first speech in Belarusian language. And Khrushchev then said, "Kirill, are you crazy? What the hell are you doing? I didn't understand you at all. Those nations who will be first to speak purely Russian language will be the first in the communities." And as a result of this politics, in the middle of the 1980s, no one Belarusian school left in the cities. No one. All people who studied in Belarusian schools lived in the rural area, and once again, rural area is a stigma of backwardness. In the 1980s, unexpectedly appeared new wave of Belarusian national movement. And its leaders start to support Belarusian language, Belarusian identity, Belarusian history, and opened the site of the mass extermination of civilians near Minsk under the name Kuropathy. And Kuropathy began used as a tool of the anti-communist propaganda. By the end of the 80s, during the period so-called perestroika, and in the first years of independence, this comparatively small group, predominantly intellectuals, supported not only Belarusian language, but also liberalization of political situation in the country. And to be true, those small group of intellectuals led Belarus to independent state in 1991. But for most of people, this independence means unemployment, the fall of the living standard, and they start to think that all these dramatic changes coincided with Belarusian language and Belarusian culture and democracy. That is why in 1994, Lukashenko won the victory and in absolutely democratic elections. It's absolutely true. And he restored Soviet-style symbols of Belarus. He restored the domination of Russian language, and he supported the history of World War II, or Great Patriotic War, as a core of the national historical narrative. In this situation, Kuropathy become a kind of unwanted heritage. In this situation, to have true national identity means the label of the political enemy. In this situation, just the using of Belarusian language was dangerous for a person because this person could be accused as a nationalist. Nevertheless, In the beginning of the 21st century, after the first conflict in between Lukashenko and Putin, there were some changes in the national historical narrative and historical attitude to the past. Of course, Great Patriotic War remained in the core, and in Minsk was constructed new museum of the war near the Minsk kind of militaristic Disneyland called Stalin's Line. But in the same time, they were reconstructed in very good quality medieval castles of Nesvizh, of Grodno, and they become some kind of alternative symbols for Belarus. So it means not only war, but medieval culture also. And especially after the annexation of Crimea, Lukashenko's authority not just supported Belarusian culture and language, they rather tolerated the activity of civil society to do it. And culmination, yes, I understand, just a minute. And culmination of this was the celebration of 100 years anniversary of Belarusian People's Republic in 2018. It was highly controversial and inconsistent process. And first of all, because of the relation in between state and Belarusian language. And now Belarus was, and now Belarus, the only country in the Eastern Europe in which those languages who allowed it in the past to construct the state now in the discriminated situation. And it's a very dangerous situation. It's not only challenging, dangerous situation for the existence of the state as such. And just 1 minute about 2020. In 2020, first time in its history, people of Belarus showed that it was not simply population, but independent force. Belarusians proved that they were not probably, but first time in history, definitely Belarusians, not manipulated object, not a victim of the number of Polish uprising, Russian Revolution, and world wars, but independent nation which would like to live in an independent European free society. But 2020, this is a year with a bitter taste of defeat. It was the year of the farewell with illusions. Illusions that criminal authorities can be defeated with the flowers and clean streets after demonstrations. We also learned, we asked, we cried, we prayed for support, and we received a lot of deep concerns and sanctions. After the sanctions, the export from Belarus to European countries rose in 60%. And we learned that deep concerns is just constructive materials to pave the road to the hell. And the name of the hell is a Christian prison in Minsk. The name of the hell is Bucha, is Irpin, Mariupol. And I do believe if Lukashenko had been stopped in 2020, there would be no invasion in Ukraine now. As a historian, I do believe that such regimes like of Lukashenko and Putin have no future. But as a historian, I do know the road to new Belarus will be very hard and long. And I would like to thank all of you for supporting us now and in the future, and today for your attention. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to express gratitude for all the organizers of this very interesting conference. I think it's very important to remind everyone, especially in Europe, why it's important to have the Soviet Union be demolished. But unfortunately, as we see, Soviet Union continues to its life, its mentality, because what is happening right now in Ukraine and the world is a continuation of the same thinking as it used to be in the Soviet Union. I'm very happy to be here. I would like to stress our full solidarity towards the Ukrainian struggle for freedom and for the victory. I very much hope that Ukraine will come from this war victorious, because it will influence the future of our part of Europe as well. So we will be very much dependent on what is going on in Ukraine. But I would like to remind everyone that what is happening now in Ukraine has its beginning in 2008. I will just continue the same narrative which was just mentioned, that we were the first victims of the Russian aggression outside of Russia. Georgia was attacked by Russia in 2008, August of 2008, and 20% of our territories are still occupied as we speak today. The gross human rights violations are taking place on our occupied territories in Abkhazia and Sinaloa in South Ossetia, and creeping annexation is ongoing. Every day, the Russian military and FSB forces are just taking new territories. Encircling new territories and putting them barbed wire fences. Now, our today's topic is the ethnic tensions in Georgia and by the end of the Soviet Union. And in order to discuss this particular period, we need to go a little bit farther into the history in order to understand what really happened by the end of the 80s, beginning of 90s. I would like to also go into the history, because Georgia is also one of the oldest Christian countries in the world. We are very proud of our language, of our history, of our culture, and of course, we were always located in a very particular, very important spot in the world, mainly surrounded by the Muslim countries and Muslim tribes from all parts, and we consider ourselves as a forefront of the Christianity. So therefore, we think that Georgia is Europe. Georgia belongs to Europe. Georgia is one of the most genuine European countries, and we are striving to go to Europe as fast as possible, and we're doing, I hope, everything for that reason. So, just to remind you again that 1991 we regained our independence. Georgia actually became independent in 1918. This was the first independence after the Bolsheviks defeated the Tsar in Russia. Georgia has used this possibility to declare its independence, and first Georgian Democratic Republic came to life. It was a very short-lived republic, only for 3 years, but nevertheless we managed to have our constitution, our state, and we were very successful in building our relations with European continent. When I was working here as an ambassador just several years ago, we discovered also that it was not known in Georgia or in Denmark either that we had our representative, our diplomat, our ambassador sitting in Copenhagen, covering from here Sweden. So in these 3 years, the 6 months, we had our representative here. Unfortunately, Georgia wasn't recognized by Denmark, but we were doing absolutely the same job as our diplomats are doing right now in Europe. So we regained our independence in 1991, but before that, Georgia really went through a very difficult period of ethnic struggle. And I would like to once again go into the history. Georgia is one of the most multi-ethnic countries in the world. Many scholars compare it with Balkans, with Afghanistan, but it's much broader picture. We have more than 50 nationalities living in our part, in this part of Europe, and they have all their strong ethnical feelings. And when the first Georgian Democratic Republic came to force, the government of the Social Democratic government of Georgia they were fighting different outside forces, but also they were fighting this first ethnic expressions in place in Georgia. Many big minorities were in Georgia present at that time, but I would like to outline two major ones. These were Abkhazians and Ossetians. I don't want to go into deep into describing, but Georgia coexisted. Those ethnicities coexisted with Georgia for many centuries. So the main problem was coming from the north. The Bolshevik Russia was not recognizing Georgia's independence, and they were trying by all means to instigate the ethnic conflicts to help those ethnicities to fight against the central government, but not always they did not always succeed. It was very interesting to know that in 1919, the Danish army was fighting against the Georgia Social Democratic Republic, but they failed. They lost this fight, and it was followed by repercussion from the Georgian government. Actually, when people and scholars describe the ethnic conflicts in Georgia, they always say that in the beginning of 20th century, it did not bear the pattern of ethnicity. It was more social problems, when the social economic problems were at large. But after the reoccupation of Georgia by the Soviet army, immediately the new so-called autonomous republics were created by the Soviet rulers, and we had in Georgia 3 of them. The first was Abkhazian Autonomous Republic, South Ossetian Autonomous Republic, and Adjara Autonomous Republic. When I was studying the issue very thoroughly, many scholars believe that this was the policy of divide and rule, but in the reality this was not only that. The communists believed that in the future there will be no borders at all. That communists and socialists will win at the end of the day, and that will not matter how many autonomous republics or what kind of borders there are. So therefore they were dividing it according to the ethnicities. They were dividing it according to the separate cultures, and they were carving the territories inside the countries. So there were two very interesting approaches, and in the communist, from the communist point of view. The first belonged to Lenin, who introduced so-called korenization, as indigenization. So the ethnicities, the small ethnicities all over the Soviet Union, they were given very strong rights. Their cultural freedom was promoted. They were given universities. Their languages were promoted. It lasted for quite a while, for approximately 10 years after Stalin turned the wheel and introduced so-called titular nation approach. So which means that the titular nations in appropriate countries were given much more rights than smaller minorities. So actually, we can consider this particular period as the beginning of these ethnic tensions in Georgia, because unfortunately, this titularization, or titular nations approach was very badly misused by some communist party leaders of Georgian origin. I'm particularly mentioning this because one of them was Beria. Beria was also Georgian, as you are aware, and he started so-called Georgianization of Abkhazia. And it was, many scholars say that this was the first big mistake, because the Abkhazian language was banned, Abkhazian schools were banned, and people were not allowed to use their own identity, and it caused very strong opposition towards what the communists were doing. But we don't want to see, Beria and Stalin, they were just the same kind of occupants, Russian occupants as we see them today. We don't want them to be, confused with Georgians. Notwithstanding of their Georgian origin, they did everything what was in their purpose. In terms of what has been done in the beginning of 30s of 20th century, we only see the huge damage of these inter-ethnic relations and the real birth of ethnic tensions inside Georgia. It needs to be noted that Abkhazia, at the beginning, when the Soviet forces came in, was given full union status. Abkhazia became, in 1921, Abkhazia was one equal socialist republic of Abkhazia, Soviet Socialist Republic of Abkhazia, but inside the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. So they had this status for 10 years. It was then demoted and revoked by Stalin, and they were demoted as the Autonomous Republic of Abkhazia. So many things played in a way. They foreprogrammed actually what happened in late in 80s, because Abkhazians continued to demand from Soviets to return this full union status throughout the full period of the Soviet rule, and they were very actively supporting the isolation of Abkhazia from the core of Georgia. During the period of the so-called Georgianization of Abkhazia, unfortunately, the percentage of Abkhazians living in Georgia, in Abkhazia, Georgia, has really strongly diminished. From the 25%, they came back to 17.8%, and the number of Georgians increased. But there were many reasons for that. And not only the Georgians were just brought into Abkhazia forcefully, but they were invited for different kind of jobs. Like, for example, Stalin's vision was to develop Abkhazia as the tobacco and citrus region, and therefore many different ethnicities like Armenians, like Greeks, like Georgians, they were going there to look for a job. And therefore the number of other ethnicities was increasing in Abkhazia. So Abkhazians at the end of 80s became a minority in that region of Georgia. So there were 70% Abkhazians and 46 Georgians. Very unfortunate development happened in when Georgia was asking for the independence, and by the end of 80s, beginning of 90s, we had very strong will to get loose from the Soviet Union. And you know that our first president, who was dissident for many years, he really consolidated these powers in Georgia. Actually, many forget when discussing the fall of Soviet Union, but Georgia was one of the first countries who suffered the very painful episodes in our recent history. 1989, on the 9th of April 1989, when there was a big demonstration in Tbilisi, the Russian tanks just came and killed 21 young children, I mean people, and 16 of them were women. So the Georgia paid actually a very high price for its independence, but it always somehow gets forgotten by the West when we speak about this particular period of the Soviet dismantle and Soviet dissolution. In that time, unfortunately, the first president of Georgia, introduced a very nationalistic policy, and he started to speak very loudly against the minorities living in Georgia. It was exactly what he should not have done. In that particular tense period, because all over the 80s, the Abkhazians and Ossetians, they were asking the Central Soviet Committee to grant them more autonomy, to grant them union status again, to relieve them from the entirety of Georgia. So therefore, the ground for these ethnic clashes was already very much ripe. Before actual confrontation started, actually I was very much interested to see what the position of the Soviet propaganda and Soviet rulers was. And until 1989, they were actually not supporting the secession of the small ethnicities inside the Soviet Union, because they understood that if it happens, then a lot of conflicts will arise. There will be 90 or more ethnic conflicts in place, so they were not in favor of it. But after 1989, when they understood that it is unstoppable anymore, they couldn't influence this process, they have started to instigate these ethnic feelings in order to better control the situation on the ground. So therefore, they supplied arms, they supplied money, they supplied political help to the minorities in Georgia, and help them by all means in order to request more freedom from Georgia. So the uprise of nationality actually was not unique to Georgia only. We have seen that in that particular period of time. In many other republics, it was already mentioned, and in Nagorno-Karabakh, it was Transnistria, etc. This national uprise took place, but it was not unique only to one particular ethnic group. Actually, it was unique to all ethnicities living on the in the Soviet Union, because when the Georgian nationalistic movement started to develop. At the same time, we see the development of the Abkhazian and Ossetian nationalistic feeling. So it was common approach to the entire country. It is very interesting to see that when you ask the contemporary scholars or contemporary politicians, they speak about the ethnic tension, ethnic conflicts in Georgia, then you need to analyze what exactly does it represent for those ethnicities. For example, for Georgians, this is absolutely political process which is led by the Russian government against Georgia, so, in order to not allow Georgia to move forward. But if you ask the Abkhazians, for them is also the same. It's an absolutely political process which doesn't allow, which does allow them to get rid of Georgians and create their own national statehood. So therefore, it's very interesting to follow how the ethnic conflicts are perceived by the parties themselves. So they see that it's a political process and nothing to do with the ethnicities at all. So when the fall of the Soviet Union happened, we received those two conflicts. We received the conflict first in South Ossetia, region South Ossetia, which is the center of, in the heart of Georgia, and second with Abkhazia, which lasted 1992, 1993, and we received on our soil almost 400,000 internally displaced persons from both regions of Georgia. So we now have the majority of the Georgian population from both regions expelled from those territories. The narrative of the Russian narrative after that has been always that we need to pay particular attention to the self-determination of nations, and we need to proceed on that path. But it's absolutely false in terms of Georgia, because in order to accept the self-determination of nations, first of all, you need to return people back. You need to ask those indigenous people who were there what their opinion about this, and it will, of course, present absolutely different picture. Georgia, as you know, made a lot of mistakes in the beginning of 90s. Unfortunately, we couldn't manage to calm down the reality and to find a common language with our two major ethnic groups, and it was very well utilized by the Russian side. After 2008, Russia decided to first intervene militarily in Georgia, and then to recognize officially our two separatist regions, Abkhazia and Flindt region, and then force other countries to do the same. Unfortunately, they couldn't succeed with that, because only several countries, except of Russia, recognized the independence, so-called independence of Abkhazia and Flindt region, South Ossetia. In our understanding, the main reason why Russia is doing this policy, or was doing this policy, of course, was to present Georgia in the worst possible light to the Europe and to the civilized world, to show everyone that we are a failed state, that we will never succeed, that Georgia will never become a part of the European family of nations, as one would think. But this is exactly what we would like to oppose. This is exactly what we would like to tell you, that not to agree on these rules of game. Because if Russia wins this war, that Russia wins this play, then you will believe that Georgia will not succeed. Then it means that we will just agree with the Russian policy of actions. Unfortunately, till today, we see that Russia tries to continue the same policy. The people from both occupied territories of Georgia are not allowed to cross the administrative border to come to Georgia. They are not allowed to take the Georgian passports. They are not allowed to participate in all of the humanitarian projects directed towards them, and they are not allowed to participate in any social life outside of Abkhazia and Flindt South Ossetia. Therefore, this propaganda, which was discussed at large here, is very much working on them as well. They are absolutely dependent on what information they get from Russia, what they receive, kind of information they receive from them, and how the Russia presents the reality to these people. But on the other hand, when you look at the history, the recent history of the last 30 years, this conflict has lasted from 1990s till today. They are absolutely dependent on the finances coming from Russia. They couldn't manage to create their own really independent institutions, governments, state institutions. They couldn't manage to develop real independency from the Russian influence. So therefore, they are receiving all the resources, all the finances from Russia, and are still very heavily dependent on them. We very much hope that the situation which takes place right now will also have its influence on Georgia as well, because we hope that, I repeat myself, that Russia will lose this unfair war against the civilized world, and all these occupied territories, including Abkhazia, Georgia, including Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Transnistria, Moldova, will become, will reunite with their states, and this conflict will end. But of course, no one is naive that it will be that easy. We understand in Georgia that after Russia retreats from all territories, we will need to find a common language with Abkhazians. We will need to find common points in order to agree about our common future within one country, within one nation. I think I will stop here, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions on that particular point. Thank you very much.
Belarus is a country between Russia and Europe and the EU. You should always have good relations to your neighbors. In the presidential election in 2020, the Social Democratic candidate said, "I'm not sure that we should only have good relations to the EU." What's your opinion about relations to Russia and relations to Europe or Belarus? What do you think about in the long future about relations for Belarus to Russia and to the EU?
The double vector policy. Can you have a double vector foreign policy?
You see, for the long periods of time, Lukashenko tries to find the balance in between Russia and so-called West countries, first of all, European Union. But now it is completely in the past.
And can
now he completely oriented only to Russia.
And can you have in the future, should you have a double policy, if you're a democratic?
To my mind, if we will have a new Belarus in the future, Belarus should be a kind of Switzerland in the Eastern Europe.
Yes.
Not in the EU, not in Russia, not in NATO. To my mind, is the best option. Maybe like not only Switzerland but Finland. It's not optimistic option, but rather realistic.
But that also implies that you think Russia will stay like Russia. That implies that you find that Russia will always be a tension.
I'm rather pessimist in this question.
I think also, Gigi, what your presentation said in many ways was that, if Ukraine prevails, if Ukraine wins, it's not only the liberation of Ukraine and the independence of Ukraine, but it's actually also the independence of Georgia, it's the independence of Belarus, it's the independence of all the countries that are actually captured at the moment. So there's a sort of capture that is still not, liberation is still not taking place, even though Soviet Union dissolved 31 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. I think it will be very important that after the victory of Ukraine, that Russia retreats from all the occupied territories, not only from Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, but also from Georgian occupied territories, and also from Transnistria. I mean, it needs to stop everywhere, not only in Ukraine, but I think it will be the case, and they have absolutely the same feeling everywhere, not only Georgia, but Abkhazians and South Ossetians also understand that if Russia loses this war, then it will not be the same reality again, which used to be prior.
Yeah,
My name is Adrian Wagner. I have a question to Gigi. So there are several accounts of Russian activists in opposition to Putin that has not been allowed to enter Georgia, like Lyubov Sobol is one of them, and Dmitry Gudkov is another. And it's a really a worrying tendency because there are a lot of human rights activists and journalists who are not allowed to flee from Russia or through Georgia. So why would be that? You have mentioned that Georgian authorities are dependent on Russian money. And then the other one, should we be afraid of Georgia eventually giving up on their activists? Because there is an agreement between Georgia and Putin. If he demands people to be delivered out to Russia, that they will do it, they have to. So should we be worried for all the activists from Belarus and from Russia who are currently in Georgia?
What I was telling, the occupational regimes are fully financially dependent on Russia. This was the regimes in Abkhazia and in all region. I hope that the Georgian government is not financially dependent on Russia, but since for the 1 year I don't represent the Georgian government anymore, I can speak much more freely and tell you that the current Georgian government has chosen very interesting path towards Russia after 2012. They really decided to abandon the policy which was in place before. So they decided that it would be better to find a common language with Russia, and they established these separate formats with relations with Russia. We don't really want relations with them in 2008 because of understandable reasons, but they decided to have the special formats with Russia, and they trying to sweeten this economic embargo and so on. I mean, they succeeded with some regard, but on the other hand, nothing really changed, and Russia continues its aggressive policy towards Georgia. As I mentioned, all the crippling annexation is taking place on a daily basis, and the policy actually turned absolutely futile. I mean, after 10 years, Georgian government has really didn't achieve any success with regard to either the occupation or any improvement of relations with our regions of Abkhazia and Flindt. So I think what the Georgian government is doing right now is trying to not to irritate Russia. I mean, this was a very official policy of this ruling party when they came into power in 2012. They were not even hiding this. They were telling that Georgia should not be the item of the harsh discussion between Russia and the West. We should disappear. And they literally did it because Georgia has really disappeared from the international agenda. No one remembers Georgia. Look at us. We're speaking about Ukraine. We're speaking about what Russia is damaging in the world. And no one is remembering about Georgia. That Georgia was the first victim, really, not the Russians in Russia, but Georgia was the first victim in 2008 when where the Russia intervened physically by military force and occupied our territories. So therefore, they actually achieved this, but by achieving this, they didn't get any reward for that because Russia continues the same aggressive policy against Georgia, and we just became some invisible state with unclear policy. And I'm telling this everywhere that this very wrongful approach towards this not irritating Russia has turned against the country itself. We have really lost our international standing. Now, many in Europe consider that Georgia is not Georgia. There's no problems anymore. That Georgia is no obstacle. I mean, what is happening there? No one remembers Georgia. I mean, this is what they have achieved. They have absolutely dismantled everything what was done before. Very unfortunate.
And should the people who have fled to Georgia, should they?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, this was a very good question because I don't have evidence. We don't have evidence for that. But of course, this fits into this non-irritation policy. I mean, those oppositional those journalists who are very heavily looked for in Russia, who are very heavily, they are not allowed in order to not to cause Russia to divert its attention toward Georgia. And of course, they might be extradited to Russia. No one can exclude this. We remember very good the example of the Azerbaijani journalist who was detained and was extradited to Azerbaijan 3 years ago. This is really a very unfortunate development because this is not what the Georgian people want. And the Georgian people are in full support of the civilized world. If you follow the developments after 24th of February, there were daily demonstrations, many tens of thousands of people standing in the streets
in the capital of Georgia. So there is a big rift between the people of Georgia and the current governments. And we're telling this everywhere. This rift is only widening with the development of events in Ukraine. And everyone is saying that the current Georgian government is more leaning towards Russia. But by doing this, they really have absolutely no guarantee of everything. And on the coffee break, we were discussing just that, I mean, everyone in the world, everyone except of the Georgian government sees that the next target of Russia, if Russia in some way succeeds in Ukraine, will be Georgia and Moldova. Everyone understands, except of the Georgian government. I don't know what they count on or what they think, but they really somehow think that it won't happen, but it will happen. I mean, Georgia is the natural next perspective for Russia. It doesn't matter Putin loses or he wins, he will need to show some progress inside domestically. He might attack Georgia just without any reason. And I just would like to highlight that all these doubts which existed in the world on the events in 2008 were lifted in 2014 and 2022. Russia, without any pretext, attacked Ukraine, attacked a foreign country, and invaded territory. So, I mean, what Georgia lost in 2008 the most, this was the propaganda, the Russian propaganda. Russia persuaded the whole world inside whole world, I mean, in Europe, that it was somehow, it could have been somehow Georgia's fault that the territories of Georgia became occupied by Russia.
And I know there was a strong youth movement there is in Georgia called Shame.
Yes.
And this youth movement is about actually the shame of the cooperation with the Putin government.
Yeah.
And there is who was
I would like to ask, for the last time it was a lot of Russian who immigrated to Georgia. I would like to know the figures. How many people from Russia, how many people from Belarus, how many people from Ukraine now, and maybe from another nationality. What is your figure?
Yes, according to recent information on the open sources, we know that 45,000 Russians came to Georgia in the last 2 months and 15,000 Belarusians. And jointly they have brought with them, according to 1.5 billion US dollars. I mean, they came with quite huge finances to Georgia. And these are the numbers for Russia and Belarus, but we know approximately 30,000 also Ukrainians. And this is also, of course, understandable, this is a huge challenge for Georgia, and it is always also discussed in the Georgian society. Opposition puts this question quite often: how can we trust? How should we prove? What can we do with so many people? But it's still on the table. I mean, no, there is no more solution.
I don't have a question. I have a message to our Georgian representative. Many years ago, I translated for the Danish TV the Georgian film Pokayanya. I don't know what that is in English. What is it?
Remorse.
Remorse, yeah, Remorse. And I have been thinking of this film during this last month with Putin behaving like he does, because he has many similarities between the main figures of that film. So I would like, maybe I would go public in Denmark and ask the Danish TV to retransmit it.
Yeah, great idea. Actually, the antagonist in that movie, this is the prototype of Belarus. This guy, this movie about him and what kind of personality. But absolutely correct. I mean, the same kind of reality. Thank you for that. It was very, very strong movie, good movie.
Now we are coming to an end. Thank you for being so enduring. I think
Europe in the 90s, and it was in the Council of Europe that we tried to open up and try to teach each other somewhat, but said that the best way you can treat the new countries that want to develop democracy is that you have some sort of tough love, meaning that you both criticize and support each other. And that was what I saw in the 90s. I was lucky enough to be in Lithuania in the 23rd of August, and I also had the opportunity to say welcome to the free world after Landsbergis had his speech. It was days where we really felt that history was changing. But some weeks ago, we were some from the foreign society that went to OSCE, where we had a bad message. They said, well, you have now experienced the best 33 years of a long period. You must be able to now see that there will be a climate crisis. Russia will still be a big issue and a threat to Europe, and we haven't seen the last pandemic, perhaps. But I think we should be optimistic. It's true that empires always have phantom pains, and indeed Russia has that. But many of the empires have overcome that, and I agree with what has been told today, that unfortunately the best way to persuade Russia of getting rid of the phantom pain is simply that they lose this war. And many things would be sorted out of that. But I also very much agree with that we should use both carrot and stick, yes. So we should do both because naturally in the long run we have to live with each other. And I remember the first time we were in Russia, in the Council of Europe was in Russia, there was some talk about historical borders. And if you look at that, simply we should have 4 times European space, because we have, when you look at the map during the times, well, Denmark ruled England and the Nordic countries sometimes, and we could continue with that. But the most important thing is that we learn to live with each other, that we don't want to solve minority problems with creating new states and new wars, that we know all that the countries have the responsibility of their minorities and not other countries. So this lesson we should learn, and we should also learn that democracy is always at stake, and it is difficult to develop a democratic state, especially those who were under the Soviet Union's rule. They have some heritage which has been hard to get rid of. But we have to fight, and we, in this moment, admire Ukraine for bearing the burden of this fight for democracy. Thank you for coming today.